past year, let alone the past decade, seems like an incredibly sexually violent period with enormous expressions of hatred towards women across the globe for both very particular reasons that share misogyny. So in other words, I would argue that sexual violence is a polyversal problem to deal with. In other words, that it overlaps and connects and yet is distinct, given the particular struggles that are within any particular country or continent or on the globe. All right, so that what we may see is gender violence being accentuated in places where women are entering the public sphere more, where there is more crisis around the particular meaning, the religious coding of a society, and the way it comes into conflict with particular new needs of what women are supposed to be doing or not. But in just even mentioning this issue of sexual violence, I'm really trying to say that sexual violence is never a singular incident, even if it happens horrifically to a singular individual person. So I mean, again, I'm just trying to take the theme of earlier and say that sexual violence is a very particular site that is always an intersectional one as well. And I'm going to play with that idea for you to, you know, in how we talk about it, to see whether that works for you or not, or whether it allows you to become more radical or more inclusive in the way that you might think to work on a politics that works on this issue. So like I did this morning, I go in and out, you know. I don't complete ideas for you because the ideas need to be completed by you. Okay, that's the intellectual style that I use with people that I intend to learn from as well as share what I know, all right? Sexual violence, I think, it has been used as a very singular site by both feminists and people who are not feminist, trying to just pigeonhole it as a single issue rather than seeing it as always necessitating a larger politics as well. So one way of making this argument is to say that sexual violence exists everywhere. I mean, whether you want to see that as rape, whether you want to see that as sexual molestation, whether you see it as sexual traumatization, that it exists at every site. And that means at every site of labor, whether that's in the domestic labor of someone as a wife and mother in a home, whether it is on a job where you are paid wages, whether it is part of the reifying of your identification with a particular race, like in the history of chattel slavery in the United States. Slavery is usually thought of as a racial construct, that black people were enslaved, which gets in the way of understanding that it was as racialized and sexualized a system simultaneously. So black slave women sexual violence was used as a repeated aspect of their enslavement. And that sexual violence could be battery. It very often was rape in terms of the actual reproduction of new slaves. The very rainbow of colors that exists in the United States, from black to dark brown to light brown to cream to all of the 28 different distinctions of color that are often made, that comes from the history of rape in the system of slavery. Yet if you say that racism is the definition of slavery, you are silencing the invisible, visible slavery of particular black women in that system. So the point again is not to say that slavery, chattel slavery, is a gendered system. It was a racist gendered system. You need both of those phrases to really get at the particular political structuring of sexual violence into the system here of racism as well. In terms of the status of any or all women as a wife and a mother, levels of sexual violence in every country, it is never less than 1 in 3 women who suffer some form of sexual violence or battery as wives and mothers. So right now in the United States, they're calling rape an epidemic on the college campuses in the US, because it is now documented at 1 in 5. Across the globe, it is 1 and 3. It is the phrase, therefore, of 1 billion rising that is organized by the 1 billion rising movement to say, to stop violence against women. So the act of rape, as though it is not intimately connected to every area of everyday life of women. All right, so that would be to multiply its understanding and to see it in more places. Another, I just said that misogyny is war in another form. So to me, you cannot be a feminist, or a feminist that I would want to work with, if you believe that war is a necessary end to your means, okay? And so when Hillary Clinton has really authorized the Iraq war, the Afghan war, is pushing for a full-blown Syrian war, the point here is misogyny is involved in that process. You know, there is no way that sexual violence is not part of that process. It's already been documented horrifically for the Iraq and the Afghan wars. And also, sometimes misogyny can be practiced against a man in the sense that it is a violation of the body and thinking often of the female body. In Abu Ghraib, there were female soldiers, US soldiers, violating male Muslim bodies to make them into what? Females. Okay? They were made to wear women's underpants. So my point here, again, of the multiplicity and complexity is that the practice of misogyny, 99% of the time it's against female bodies, but it can be it is a method of degradement of the female body, and that can be done to anyone. Okay? So again, my point here is to specify and to complexify at the same time this very notion of sexual violence. So I just will share with you a few paragraphs from several pieces that I have written in the last couple of years, particularly on this issue of trying to complexify and open the coalitional political work that can be done to end rape culture, okay? And so this was just from a very short piece saying there is no single story for rape. Sexual violence is a huge plague across the entire globe. Rape is particularly terrorizing for girls and women in both peacetime and war, in both public and private spaces. Sexual assaults happen to 1 in 5 women on college campuses right now, as I earlier had said. They happen to 1 in 3 women more generally across the globe. This issue of sexual assault is being exposed today as an open secret. Now again, it's interesting the way that so much of the discussion when it comes to sexual violence or misogyny, I'm really playing on language to say that so often it is the invisible until you make it visible. So the point here is that so much sexual violence and sexual degradation is an open secret. In terms of politicians, everyone knows they do sexual violence daily, and yet it's a secret that is open. I would argue part of what happened in the US just in the last week was Donald Trump was stupid enough to take a secret and say that what? It's no longer a secret. He made it public. You know, when Bill Clinton had his sexual liaisons and his moment with Monica Lewinsky, he was not excoriated the way that Trump is being now because he followed the rules, okay? He violated sexually in private, and when asked if he did, he lied. And that's what he was supposed to do, right? You don't tell the lie, the open secret. So again, one of the things that I'm really, throwing out to think about this moment is something very amazingly significant is happening when the secret and the invisibility is being exposed. So I just want to say one other point that isn't directly related to sexual violence, but is completely related, which is this, that as a professor of politics and a writer of politics, what I do know is that the purpose of politics, and that means the power structure, okay, its purpose always is to mystify itself, never to expose it. In other words, as long as it's covered up, it's really hard to change it. So what is just so excitingly interesting to me in this moment is, why is the exposure in process now? Okay, so in other words, when people say that the nation state is in crisis, I absolutely think it is. It's in crisis because the mystification of its operation is being diluted. To say the 1%, that's already telling a major lie openly about what? About democracy, okay? Capitalist democracy, bourgeois democracy, liberal democracy, whichever one you use, okay? Its rule is that politics and economics are separate. The bourgeoisie does not rule. In feudalism, they ruled. It was one and the same. The bourgeois state, you have the distinction between the two. So in some sense, to say the 1% is ruling the world and 99% of us are suffering, that is to tell the lie that we were told. Going back to earlier this morning when I say democracy does not work. It is not working the way it has to for bourgeois democracy to work, or bourgeois, now I'm adding patriarchal or misogynist democracy to work. So it's interesting that sexual violence has been a part of history throughout. Even when you had queens, okay, you had misogyny right alongside them. So in feudalism, etc. So something is happening to have people even have so much of the discourse say what? There is a rape culture. That is a very progressive moment, even if it's what? Completely horrific. So all I'm trying to say is if we're not looking at both sides of it, the rape culture, there's nothing new. The exposure of it, totally new. That's the point. So if it's been all along, it's been in every history. When I spent time in Japan just last year with many of the people fighting for recognition for the women who were called the comfort women during World War II. They lived with having been sexually prostituted and raped, and with total silence and total authorization by what? All of their nation states. for it now to be exposed in the way, we are back to still this tension between the knowable, the unknown knowns, the invisible visibilities, okay? So again, my point is, I just don't want you thinking about sexual violence with all this chaos, okay? Because that is the only thing that might actually move us to a politics that really would be revolutionary, rather than to set up a bunch of laws that are going to punish people who make acts of sexual violence, okay? And in the United States right now, there is tremendous tension about laws that punish people for anything. Because why? Because our punishing system is so unequal and racist and misogynist to begin with. The women in our prisons are treated to misogyny daily. The sexual rape of women prisoners by their jailers daily. So the idea again of does something need to change? Absolutely, but what? And it's these bigger questions that really push us to uncomfortable places. The bigger story that I'm asking you to think about when it comes to rape comes in every color, every race, every caste, every sexual preference, every domestic space, every prison, every nation. Now, that's not to universalize it, it's to ask us to think of a polyversal way of connecting across and through to a politics that goes beyond punishment and towards freedom. The culture of misogyny and its brutalization through rape needs to be exposed over and over again. But none of the present noise that all of our movements are creating is going to stop rape. So part of the argument that I was making, and to the different groups I was, this particular discussion, was to try to find a place where we can create a more inclusive coalitional politics that recognizes violence in all its differing forms, and not to distinguish one from another in a way that we cannot see the connections between them. So this is a piece that I wrote actually for 1 Billion Rising. They wanted a piece to help mobilize the movement for calling for a greater coalition. I just thought I'd read you 2 paragraphs from it to give you a sense of some of that argument. Misogyny and patriarchy pollute our world. And I actually use the word pollute in the hopes of bringing in the environmental movement. They maintain capitalism with patriarchy and racism, with all of its excesses. At the complex heart of this is the ubiquitous and mind-numbing sexual violence towards women and girls that is a global disaster. It is time to put this sexual violence in a globally articulated collective view so that we can fully see each other. It is time to do this, and we can do it. It is time to recognize that violence against women and girls is and remains the major political challenge of the 21st century. W.E. Du Bois said the great challenge of the 20th century was the racial divide. I'm taking that and saying that sexual violence is the challenge of the 21st century. I'm trying to give it here a political status, not an individual site that does not bring it into this fold. So it is a major challenge of the 21st century alongside racial, economic, gender tyranny. Sexploitation, exploitation, disrespect, disregard starts in the intimate realm of private embodied life and extends to the public realms of the economy and the state through this systemic treatment and maltreatment of women's and girls' bodies. It is our responsibility to form a coalitional global movement that gives priority to ending sexual violence in its different forms. It is also true that I live in a country that, at least for now, is at the heart of empire. It is problematic that global and imperial is so often one and the same system. But in this instance, we need to build beyond it. And then lastly, just to give you a flavor, violence has its many faces. Many of them are protected through silence and shaming. Other kinds, like warfare, are normalized as inevitable. Violence breeds more violence, so remains circuitous. Sexual violence is protected by the seal of powerful secrets and tumbles outwards towards nations and their war-making. Militarism is this form of sexual violence that dehumanizes us all. So in other words, I think it really is problematic to think war and the problem of sexual violence are not just interconnected in such a way that it becomes impossible to think about the body and the nation as not really being defined by a very similar kind of misogynist politics. Bodies absorb the Earth's violations, and the Earth's carcinogens pollute the globe. And then what I'm saying here is what we have is a rhizome knotting of people's lives together with a notion of worthlessness and shamefulness that ends in new forms of sexual violence. I thought you might find it interesting Kavita Krishna was supposed to be here and is not, but I had some dialogue with her in 2013 during the most open coalitional work here in India against rape and just the phenomenal. I mean, India led the world, women, I think, in just a phenomenal statement of resistance with hundreds of thousands of you in the streets. And it was it had a remarkable effect on women elsewhere, thinking that it is possible to stand against just horrific violence. The stories that began that initial set of political resistance were so brutal, and yet what you all did in the streets was so brave. And for people to so often think that India is one of the most violent, sexually violent countries in the world towards its women, to see its women saying no was an incredible statement of leadership that I know many of us were enormously grateful to. The same way that I feel towards the women in Argentina who were just out in the streets, a week ago, 6 million of them saying, no, you will not end abortion rights here. You will not do it. And they turned it around, all 6 million of them. So, I think we, in the United States, need to look elsewhere to our leaders who say absolutely no. But anyway, Kavita had written quite a bit about some of the ugliness of capitalism, what was happening here in this country, and the horrible rape violence that is part of a problematic economy, etc. And of course was very, very important in organizing the women in Delhi. But I did write her a note. At that point, we knew each other a little bit, given our Marxist overlap. And I do say to her, this was when I was getting ready to come, I found this in my notes. Dearest Kavita, a good and important discussion, thank you. I, however, continue to be somewhat tortured to better explain the hatred that is expressed towards women's bodies through rape, whether in war, in relationships, in whatever form, and the contextual of capitalist destructive commodification. Rape exists in somewhat semi-autonomous fashion of the particular geography or economic class structure or particular nationalist form, always dependent and threaded through the structural context, but also horrifically repetitive and polyversal. So, and then I say, I so hope we have the opportunity to have discussions about this framing. So in other words, I felt as though at the very same time that yes, we can talk about capitalist destructive commodification as a problem of how women's bodies get commodified. For me, as I say here, you know, it is a torturous set of questions. Where does the particular hatred towards female bodies so that they become battered beyond recognition? I don't feel as though capitalism can explain that without the hatred that comes from misogyny, whether that's the hatred of women's bodily power. I mean, there are many theories as to what is the source of that hatred. But it seems to me, again, that we're not moving towards that very painful kind of clarification so in the simplest way, and how to say it is, capitalism does not cause rape, just doesn't. So does rape happen in capitalist societies? Absolutely, you know. But why rape? Why that in Congo there is the hospital farm collective called City of Joy, and it's where women and girls, and I should say mainly girls, have been raped beyond bodily reconstruction during the war there. And many of those young women and girls, if they did not die in their brutal rapes, are there getting surgery to try to reconstruct their bodies so that they can continue to live, although with only partial bodily functions, and also to renew their spirit so that they can become resistors. That's the purpose of the City of Joy. The doctor who runs who is one of the main people who runs City of Joy, it is a he. He was trained, he's Black African. He was trained in Congo as a doctor. He chose to be an obstetrician. And he said he wanted to deliver babies because most women in Congo, in the process of delivering babies, they are humiliated in the process. That doctors do not treat them with respect, that if they can get to a hospital, it's not a good thing, but just in their homes, etc. It is not a moment of recognition to give birth. So he said he wanted to bring children into the world with the woman being respected in that process. So after he decided to be a doctor, he became an OBGYN, his specialty. And now he is the doctor who does all the he has not delivered a baby. He does all the reconstruction on the insides of these women who have been battered and brutalized with everything imaginable to just try to allow them normal bodily functions having nothing to do with the capacity to bear a child, you know. So I mean, that story is so compelling on so many different levels, so much different complexity as well, all right? And the idea here is that when we focus on rape culture, it seems to me that in order to really understand what rape culture is, we don't want to isolate it from the rest of culture that defines rape through misogyny and racism and imperialism, you know, and capitalism. All right, so that means, again, we're back to some of the issues of, in rape culture, there definitely have to be certain reforms, right? I mean, it seems like that's the best you can do at the moment, to just try to keep women from being violated in terms of their sexual bodies. And at the same time, it would seem to me that it's really important, as we struggle for certain legal reforms, that we always are tying them to more revolutionary understanding of how this is just a first step towards, okay? In the US today, it could be the abolition of prisons altogether. So, I mean, we have a serious abolitionist movement in the United States, led by many of the Black Lives Matter activists, who argue that the criminalization of black people, whether it's for rape or some other criminal event, that what it does is it just further re-encodes systems of misogyny and racism, and even capitalism, given that in the United States, prisons today are very much run by private companies for huge amounts of money making. So I just thought one other thing, and then we'll just see where you are and what you want to talk about, that the Say Her Name movement, which grew out of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, do you know the Black Lives Matter? Yeah? So do you know Say Her Name? Yeah? Some of you? No? So Say Her Name developed out of, after the series of killings of about 7 of the young black men that had been so publicized, and Black Lives Matter, which is led, the coinage of the name is by 3 black women. One is trans, one is gay. So it is not your typical black group, black activist group in the US that used to be led by black men, okay? But the Black Lives Matter movement and most of the mobilizations that were pretty big against the police murders were all about black men being murdered. Simultaneously, in that period, black women had been murdered by police as well. Several of them mentally ill. When police were called in just to try to get the person to the hospital, the woman was shot in the process and killed. So, without getting involved in all the particulars in the US, what started to happen was black feminists who had been part of the black feminist movement and the black socialist feminist movement in our country for the last 40 years, basically said, we need to say her name too. In other words, that it became the feminist piece of the Black Lives Matter, so that you'd have the hashtag Black Lives Matter for the universal all black people, all right, but then say her name, a statement saying that when you say black, most people think you mean men. So we're back to some of the earliest statements of the black feminists that I was talking to you about this morning, where they were saying, people always think, there was a book even written, all the blacks are men, all the whites are women, and all the women are white, and some of us are brave. And that was the black women, okay? So if you say women, people think you mean white. You say black, people think you mean men, and here we are, black women, where are we, all right? So some of those same women are part of the Say Her Name, and then what we had was a vigil in New York City with the names of 7 of the women who had been murdered, with big posters trying to bring recognition to the black women who, again, had been left invisible, silent, as part of this movement. Now, most of the discussion centered around the sexual violence that many of these black women who had been killed had suffered, either in prisons themselves or by husbands, okay, or by other criminals. But the point was that the minute they started to say her name, sexual violence was as important as racial violence was as important as class violence. But it wasn't until it was specified that then that became an issue for really opening the discussion, all right? And then after we had done that, just shortly after Say Her Name really started to catch on in the States, then there was his name was Holtzclaw, and he was a policeman in Oklahoma, and he was known, by time we finished the whole investigation and it was done, he had raped 6 black women at the point of when he was arresting them for minor violations. And basically, he would always choose someone who had a violation so that he could violate them, and they knew that if they said anything about it, that they would not be believed. So it was like double violation, all right, really making it a very silenced moment. Finally, he was actually brought up on charges. He is in jail now for life for these 13 rapes in the end that were proven. But it was also proven that he was under investigation for a sexual violation, and he was allowed to continue on the job in this process while all of these other new violations happened. So this really mobilized a lot of anger about the intersectionality led by these black women, the idea that if we don't intersect these discussions, we'll go nowhere together, all right? And by the time they finished, it was really this very important political moment of when you start to put the pieces together this way. We had a really mobilized group against what? Against incarceration, against prisons, against police officers who violate the law, against overcriminalization, against rape, against sexual violence, and we really did start to make some headway, again, reformist headway. He now is in jail. Now, I must say, a lot of people I worked with were much happier than I was that he was in jail for life. I mean, I just hate the idea of anyone being in jail. And for life, I really get tears, no matter who you are. So, but the point again is, you do what you can in particular moments. So I'm going to finish with this one point that isn't particular to the issue of sexual violence, but shows you the way that actually happened. I mean, we had one other intersectional moment first. So right around the time that all of this is happening about black men and trying to stop the violence against them, Obama puts forward a policy, and he says that he wants to put forward this policy to really end racism in the United States. And his new policy was called My Brother's Keeper, okay? And it was a policy to help young black boys, you know, in the schools, who were in juvenile delinquent places, just to really help black boys, you know, to give them an extra chance and extra opportunity. So a group of us who had been working on some of these issues, but led by Kimberly Crenshaw, who some of you may have read, she started a critique saying to President Obama in an open letter, "Why do you think you end racism by helping black boys? How about ending racism by helping black boys and girls?" She says, "I'm not saying we don't want to help black boys, but we also want to help black girls, both. You can't end racism without ending misogyny." So a group of black women wrote a public letter that went into all the newspapers saying exactly this, okay? Then I'm just trying to show you on-the-ground coalitional work. About 2 weeks later, a letter was written by black men, gay black men, straight black men, trans men, saying, As black men, we do not think we can end racism without ending misogyny. This should be about black men and black women alike, black boys and black girls alike. And in the interim, a bunch of us did research to show that black girls were thrown out of school at the same rate as black boys. They were criminalized at about the same, just a little bit less than black boys. That many of them were suspended from school at 10 times the rate of white girls. So, I mean, the distinction of what black girls were going through was really unbelievable, yet this was not part of the policy initiative. So once again, things are there but not seen, not named, so they remain invisible, etc. So then Kim wrote to me and said, okay, we got a letter from black men, we got a letter from black women, we need a letter from white women in this country saying, MBK, my brother's keeper, it has to be both. So we wrote a letter that was harder to write than you might think. She wanted me to do it with a lot of leading, feminists, white feminists, and some who said, well, why do we have to say we're white? And I thought, okay, well, how about because we are? But, but historically, it really means everything, because the whole idea is that you don't have to say you're white. That's the whole point, right? You get to just be. You're a feminist. You're not a white feminist, You get to just be the universal here. So whatever. But we got through that, and we finally got a statement, and that one, went out as well. Except, as our letter is going out, there are 3 more killings of black men, and there was a real concern that a letter from white feminists saying this at this moment could make it really difficult for black feminists to be said that they are too white. Okay? So what I'm trying to, we actually worked through it, it worked out, we really made some movement. I just don't want you to think that, I know some of you think that, that some of the language I'm using and the ideas, they're just like too big, too radical, too whatever. Well, no, they're not. And then there's this micro level of work that you do, but if you don't have those big ideas, your micro is really micro. But if you know that what you're doing is little, it's never as little as it is, because you know that there are these bigger issues that you're tying to and you're pushing forward towards. Okay? So if you said to me, tell me one thing that could make the world just, make this world really free, I'd say end rape. And for those of you who would think, well, just that? And me, I'd say that's everything. Because what I just tried to show you is that rape here is the absolute site of intersection of the exploitation and the dehumanization. That's it. So, my point is that no, that's not reducing anything to a singular feminist argument. I'm saying that to end rape, just think about it. Most of you can't even probably imagine what does that even mean. But if there were no rape in the world, that'd mean no war. That'd definitely mean no capitalism. And then, well, we could just be happier on every other thing that we say. So again, it depends on what it is, how inclusive you are in the notion. And for some of you, if you're thinking, well, I think this dilutes the significance of rape, I think not. I think it really expands it, because it says to violate a human body. If you are violating a human body, there is no way you could ever even allow yourself to pretend democracy exists. So we're just back from the first thing I said. Right now, democracy does not work. No one's even thinking about ending rape.